Welcome back, everybody. I'm speaking with Farhan Thawar, VP Engineering at Shopify, not Spotify.
Correct.
About that little inside joke later. And one of the things we were talking about earlier is pairing and pair programming, to be explicit. And so, if we rewind back, both of us kind of entered the software industry in a time where 6 to 12 month release cycles were kind of the norm. And I remember being very inspired by a book by Kent Beck called Extreme Programming. And I think that, if people that kind of grew up with lowercase a agile today, right, like they would look at that and kind of look and say, duh, that's obvious, right? Like all those things are kind of underlie what we do today. But 20 years ago, that wasn't obvious, right? Like his book was a change agent, right? Like he was trying to infect change. And, there was a couple things that I took from it, right? It was kind of the start of TDD, test-driven development, which I practiced for many years. And it's kind of imbued its way. There's also a big thing that I took to, early on at the Zebra and a lot of things I've done, which was this question of asking, is there an explicit requirement for this right now? And if not, you don't do it, right? You don't incur prospective future maintenance costs on something you don't know will happen, right? Now that changes over time, right? Because when you're 3 people in a warehouse, you need to know if something is going to be a requirement now. When you're 300 people, you know if something's going to be a requirement in 6 months, right? Like that, it changes over time. But the other thing that he talked about in that book was this notion of pair programming, right? And so I know that there's been tons of debate, like it's kind of died down over the years, and like there's been other variations which we'll get to. But I'm really curious because at Extreme Labs, right? I believe at Extreme, and then at Pivotal too, and then you mentioned one of the core tenets was that everybody pairs, right? And so I guess tell me a little bit about how that came about, what worked, what didn't.
Yeah, so the founders of Extreme Labs, the way it started actually was Sunny, who was one of the co-founders, was doing a project with Pivotal Labs for a previous startup. And he got more excited about how they were building the software than the software he was building. And he was like, I need to figure out like what's going on here. And he realized that he wanted to start a company that used that similar approach. And so what Extreme Labs was like a Pivotal Labs style software shop, but focused on mobile. Because the other genius insight him and Umar had, and I went to school with Umar, was that mobile was going to be like a real form factor and a real dominating force. And they started in 2007, right after the iPhone came out, and amazing timing. And I joined in 2009. And what happened was I was just coming to hang out with Umar, and I was like, what's going on in this company? Like I saw 2 people on every computer. It was a high energy environment. Everyone was talking, but like code was getting written. They seemed to be learning at a very fast rate because they were talking so much and they were explaining things. And one person was staring at the screen, the other person was typing, they're going back and forth. I was like, I've never seen this before. And so when I joined, I learned by pairing with an intern that it was the fastest way that I've ever learned anything. So he knew Ruby on Rails. I didn't, but I knew about building scalable architectures for systems. And we built a very sophisticated like hedge fund trading tool. And I was impressed by he was learning from me as we were building and I was learning from him. And I was like, this is insane. And what I realized over time was it's a way to have a high fidelity conversation, write lots of code, learn from each other, not have siloed information, because you can actually like switch pairs with another team. It allowed you to not get distracted, right, by other things that might be happening. And you could have what we call sustainable pace. If you worked from just 9 to 6 every day, right, like 8 hours a day with a 1 hour lunch, but you were coding almost that whole time because you're pairing, it's almost like time travel. You would get way more done than most people. The other thing that was also the interesting introspection there was the bottleneck to writing good software is not hands to keyboard, right? Like one of the famous sayings about pair programming is they say, oh, if you have 2 people on one machine, won't they only write half as much code? Yep. And the answer is, oh, we hope they write even less than that.
Yep.
Because the idea is not about lines of code. It's about just the right amount of code, right? The code, I mean, we know code is a liability. You actually just want to write the minimum amount of thing. It tends to be more elegant when you have 2 people working together because they don't tend to hack. They tend to think things through, and they tend to both understand what's the things about code, which is it's going to be read more than it's written.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting point because if you look at one part of the entire delivery process, it's code reviews, right? Like peer code reviews, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's quality checking, there's also like getting getting insight on what you did, but there's sharing knowledge and insights into the code so someone other than you knows about it. And so did you find that this actually just compacted those into one, where two people didn't just like, your code reviewer didn't just cursorily understand it, they like intimately understood it?
Yeah, so the way you think about it is, you talked about Kent Beck earlier. The way that a lot of the agile practices happened was that they took a good idea and they turned the volume to 11.
Yep.
Right? So a good idea in software is to write tests that test your software. And then people were like, we should test at least 10% of our software. Then we're like 30%, 40%, 50%. And then somebody got to like, we're 100%. And somebody goes, what if you wrote the test first?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's what TDD is write the test first. And that's turning the volume up to 11. And pair programming is code reviews. It's like, we should do a code review every month, every week, every day. What if we just wrote it together?
Yep,
like exactly. That's literally, so, and that's turning up code reviews to 11. So if you think code reviews are a good idea and they're a way to share knowledge, learn, mentor someone, break knowledge silos, then why not do it all the time?
That's what about the flip side of that, I guess, which is that what did the people who came from, jobs or things where they weren't used to pairing, where they wanted their individuality, where they, and it can be intense, right? Like there's an aspect of when you're solving a problem together with someone, there's a lot of adrenaline. It's fun, it's awesome, it's exciting, but it's also intense and exhausting.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it, where we wanted to get away from like the solo, like we both worked at Trilogy. I was working 100 hours a week, writing lots and lots of code. And what's amazing about pair programming is you are definitely exhausted and depleted after an 8-hour session. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing about that is like you kind of left everything on the field. It's like going to the gym, right? Like you go to the gym for an hour, and then when you're not in the gym, your muscles are rebuilding. And what was happening here was you would go in for a very intense session for 8 hours. And then when you weren't there, your brain was recovering and new ideas were coming in. So when you came in the next day, you were fresh to then attack the problem again in a new way. And so for people who are not used to it, it takes like 2 or 3 weeks to get used to. Mm-hmm. But in many cases, people feel like they never learned as much as they did when they were in this pairing environment. And there was a good quote that I saw this week that I tweeted out that said something like, when one teaches, two learn.
I love that. Yep.
Yeah. And it's this idea that like even the teacher, the senior engineer, or the person like who's driving and teaching the nav, like is learning, because what I found is that back and forth is a constant like push and pull. Like, think about this. If I wanted to learn a lot about the zebra, wouldn't the best way to just be sitting beside you 40 hours a week for like a month? Like, wouldn't we both learn a ton about each other and about like the environment we're in?
It's funny. I've always felt that if for me to teach something, like it just helped me learn it better. And a funny little like tangential side story is I when I was in like early high school, actually this might have been middle school. We're doing algebra and the graphing calculator came out. I had my TI 85, and then like all that stuff. And the first one, I think the TI 85 was the first programmable one, like truly programmable one. And I remember our Algebra 2 teacher at the time said, if we could write a program to solve what was going on, and we had to write it ourselves, hand in the codes to make sure there's no plagiarism, we could use it on the test. Genius idea, because I, being interested in computers and that, would always write the program, and I never even had to use it because I knew it so well by having to understand it well enough to write it that like I didn't need to use it. I understood it for the test, and that was better than any kind of studying or memorization could be, because I learned it well enough for that. And so that's kind of that point of like, if you know something well enough to teach it, then you're learning it better yourself. That's
exactly right. And I think that it's counterintuitive that a senior and a junior together would be able to both learn at that in that environment. But it turns out that as long as somebody has the fundamentals of like what you're trying to do, and they just ask you questions, like here's a funny story. We have this thing called like odd pairing. Like if you have 5 people, you can't pair, right? Because you only have 2 pairs. And we had this giant stuffed banana, mm-hmm. and you would pair with the banana.
Really?
And what you're doing is you're just talking to the banana. It's like when you go to talk to somebody else and you're explaining the problem and you figure out the answer.
Yep.
Right? Like and so you would just pair with the banana. And yes, the banana is not the same as another smart engineer beside you, but by talking and doing it and like working together, you're just talking through what you're doing. And it turns out your thoughts become more logical.
That's funny, because that kind of leads me to something that I learned about a couple of years ago. that's along the lines of pair programming that I will admit, like, I don't know a ton about, but some, which is called mob programming.
Yep.
Right. And the general philosophy was like, can we take some of the aspects of pair that didn't work quite as well, which is like, what if one person on the pair like wasn't participating and was just kind of like out, right? Like some of the degenerate cases, or you have an odd number of people. And also look at the, I'm sure many of us have felt that feeling of like there's some urgent thing down in production and we're all huddled around one guy on a keyboard, or woman for that matter. And like there's that adrenaline, that feeling of like we can solve this together. Everyone's like, it's fun, it's exciting, and it's exhausting, but you get so much done. And so the based on my understanding, like that there's this general philosophy of get everyone you need to solve a problem, whether that's engineers, QE, design, product, everyone together, and you all solve that one thing together. And then there's rules around rotating, you take 7-minute stints or something like that. And, like if you're on the keyboard, you can't participate, you're just translating, right? Only other people can, but then you rotate out and things like that. So have you experienced any of that at all? Have you looked into mob programming?
Yeah, so I've definitely looked into mob programming. We do it. I mean, you've explained it much more elegantly than other people who say like it's basically one person on keyboard and everybody yelling at them. Mm-hmm. But I like the analogy you gave, which is that this is what we say in pair programming. We say, why don't you code through my hands? Mm-hmm. Right? So I'll do it, but you're telling me what to do because then I'm learning how to do it. And actually, what you typically say in pair programming is you say, the person who is least experienced should be the driver. Mm-hmm. So the navigator is basically directing them to do things. And then the driver can say, oh, why do we do it this way? And what about that? And it's amazing to see everything all the way down to the keyboard shortcuts, which is hard in COVID times. But mm-hmm. we use a remote pair programming tool called Tuple, which is very good for remote pair programming, but you don't get all the nuances as you do in person. But it's quite intense. I mean, somebody the other day asked me like, hey, one day when you retire, what do you want to do? And I said, I'm going to pay people to pair program with me, because I just want to keep learning.
That's it. So I guess the last little bit on pairing, which is if you had someone who wanted, let's say they want to get into it, they want to start doing it or start to introduce it, where would you recommend they go to learn about it?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different places. One, there's lots of stuff on like YouTube and like you can learn about pairing. I have a book on my shelf somewhere here called Pair Programming Illuminated. It's probably in one of these shelves, which is a great introduction as well. I think there are companies online that you can you can pay people to like pair with you to like help you fix your problems. Like that's another way. The other thing I would say is it's not just about programming. It can be pair designing. It can be pair like writing email. There's so many things you could just pair with. Actually, like you and I, know this person. I was working with somebody, a few years ago on something, and I said, hey, why don't we just both do the slide deck at the same time? And it was a Google Hangout. It was an hour long. We were talking and working on slides together, and I'm like, we're pairing on the slide deck. Like that's exactly what. So it doesn't have to be that. And I remember when I was at Extreme Labs, I also ran the finance department. Every 2 weeks we did pair invoicing. I would sit down, same computer, and we would generate invoices together. Like it doesn't have to be just programming.
Yeah, and it probably eliminates some of the loneliness, and you kind of enjoy it more too.
Well, this is the thing I found. We always found mistakes. Always. I found mistakes in my thing.
The error is human, right? Like
exactly, but it's funny because you think you're doing it to your best ability, and then we would do it, and we're like every time we're like, geez, I'm so glad we're doing this pairing.